Hello, welcome 40k fans and players. Today I'm going to be going over Chaos Knights in 10th edition Pariah Nexus. Chaos Knights is one of the many armies that got changed either a little or a lot from the recent data slate that came out and pretty much flipped 40k 10th edition on its butt, nerfing some armies into the ground. RIP Thousand Suns, not changing some armies. Space Wolves are still playable, and either completely changing the way certain armies played, like Tyranids and Space Marine factions that relied upon captains, or not changing or changing some armies in very minute ways, like this one did. We're gonna break this video up into parts. I'm gonna talk about the army's rules, then the detachment rules, then the stratagems, then the enhancements. I'm going to not go over every single data sheet in their index, but I will talk about the ones that I think are the most important and which ones I would recommend you run. And then I'm going to talk about allies that I think you should take in, and I will give some suggestions for lists, but I won't be showing the lists on screen. Or actually, I probably will show the list on screen. I can do that really easily. And then obviously all the lists I'm going to talk about are going to be in the description below as well. If you just want to see the lists and don't feel like watching the video, you can just go to the description now. So first, I wanted to give sort of an overarching message. And the overarching message is very simple. A lot of times when we talk about Chaos Knights, there is the unfortunate comparison that we have to make in comparing it to Imperial Knights, especially since they literally came out in the same index. I do think that Imperial Knights was the better army in the early games of 10th edition when less armies were being defensive and were being tabled by Imperial Knights really fast, because like a Crusader and some War Dogs could kill pretty much any army, which would allow them to score a lot of points in the late game, which is really good because in Mission Pack Leviathan and in Pariah Nexus, late game scoring is the most important thing. So that allowed them to really get the points where they needed to. But now, that is no longer the case. More armies are becoming more and more defensive as time goes on. They're surviving Imperial Knight Crusaders' onslaught. They're killing Knight Crusaders. They're surviving all the way to the end game. They're scoring primary, and so on and so forth. Chaos Knights have the same problem. That it's getting harder for them to actually kill things, but the difference is that Chaos Knights are not shooting themed. They're melee themed. And they're melee themed, and or they're also better at melee than Imperial Knights are, so they're able to sort of go up into the board, apply pressure, and score primary at the same time, which is the problem that I think Imperial Knights have more so than Chaos Knights do. So now that I've kind of gotten that debrief out of the way with Imp Knights and Chaos Knights, let's move on to the army rules. So the army rule of Chaos Knights adds on to their Battle Shock theme. I'm going to talk a bit more about their Battle Shock theme once I actually get to their detachment rule, but I will sort of go over this army rule as is. So, from turn 1, basically everybody in our army has a 12-inch aura that gives out a -1 to Battle Shock and leadership tests, which is a really good ability. Because with Chaos Knights, you're going to be up close and personal in your opponent's face. You're going to be real aggressive with them. So you're going to be constantly applying this debuff, basically. This army has a lot of ways to punish your opponent for failing Battle Shock, and they have ways to force your opponent to take Battle Shock more often than they already would. So stacking that on top of this -1, this -1 that you just have, you don't have to run a specific unit to get this -1. You don't have to do any sort of combo. You just have this is really good. And then additionally, starting battle round 3, now you also get +1 to wound against battle shocked enemies. So you're going to be able to continue to apply more pressure. There's more punishment to enemies that are being battle shocked, and battle shocked enemies are -1 to hit against you. Really good. So now we're debuffing battle shock, and we're punishing your opponent for failing battle shocks, which is really, really good. Super Heavy Walker, I'm not going to go into much detail, but basically it allows you to move through enemy models as long as you're taller than them, as long as you don't end your movement with an engagement range, and then you can also move over certain terrain features. that are 4 inches or lower in height. If they're higher than that, you can still move over them, but you have to roll a d6, and on a 1, you're battle shocked. There's also this Dreadblade part right here, which is about taking Chaos Knights as allies, but that's not relevant because we're trying to play the army pure. So that is the army rules. So the detachment rule, this is where I want to get more into talking about battle shock as a mechanic for Chaos Knights. So essentially, what this does, what our detachment rule says, Forged in Terror, it's an aura ability. It gives basically all of our Chaos Knights the ability that if our opponent at the start of their command phase is within 12 of one of our Knights, and they are below starting strength, not below half strength, starting strength. So if they have a unit with multiple models in it, at least one of them has to be dead. And if they're just a unit with one model, they have to at least take in 1 wound. And they have to take battle shocks. Huge. Because now what Chaos Knights is doing is if they're close to you, which most of the time they will be, they're giving you out a -1 to your battle shock. They're forcing you to take battle shocks a lot more often than you normally would be. And now they're also punishing you for failing battle shocks by buffing themselves, giving themselves these +1 to wounds, and handing you out a -1 to hit. This is why Chaos Knights is absolutely the best battle shock army in the game. I'm not going to talk too much about Chaos Demons and Tyranids, which are the other 2 armies that are really themed about battle shock, but I will say that the fact that Chaos Knights has a way to force battle shock more often, a lot of ways to punish your opponent from taking battle shock, and a debuff, all 3 at the same time, and those are all army rules, by the way. None of those are things you have to achieve by running certain units and devoting points to it. Like, before you've even put a Chaos Knight in your army, this is something you gain. Those other armies like Chaos Demons and Nids, in order to get those same level of things, there are specific units they have to run in certain orders in order to get all of those buffs. These are 3 buffs we get just by playing the army, which is why I think Chaos Knights are so good at battle shock and why they're just hands down the best one. Now, battle shock as a mechanic is a fickle thing, because at the end of the day, although you can force your opponent to make a lot of battle shocks, although you can give them the -1, it is still a 2d6 roll, and your opponent can still spike it. So sometimes they will fail. The good thing about Chaos Knights, though, is that our army can still do pretty cool things, even if our opponent doesn't fail battle shocks. It's just that battle shocks is sort of like an added bonus. And it's nice if they fail one every once in a while. Because statistically, they should fail at least 1 or 2 if you're forcing like 5 or 6 a turn, right? But I digress. So yeah, this detachment rule is really good. Being able to force your opponent to take battle shocks if they're below starting strength within 12, crazy. Because you have stuff like Skull Cannons and Chaos Demons, which can force you to take a battle shock after they shoot you, which is okay. It's not very repeatable because your opponent can avoid it a little bit. And, you know, Tyranids obviously have Shadow in the Warp and Screamer Killers, but again, that stuff is stuff you have to pay points for. This is just free. So that's the detachment rule. Forged in Terror is really good. Adds on to that battle shock theme, because trust me, when your opponent starts feeling battle shocks, it's going to start stacking up because it's going to feel bad. So the stratagems, I'm going to read them all, and then I'll give sort of my quick opinion on them. So Dreadhounds, we use it at start of shooting or fight phase. 2 War Dogs, they each get sustained hits, and if they're fighting an enemy that is battle shocked, they get hit rolls of 5-ups. War Dogs aren't great in this edition. They're not that good in Imp Knights. They're not that good in Chaos Knights. So this stratagem will not get used a lot. There is one War Dog that I do recommend running, though, and there does come times where this stratagem can be used by them. But there are specifically 2 other stratagems that I like to use in this army. And since Knights don't have a way to generate CP aside from discarding objectives or secondaries that you don't score, I don't usually use this stratagem because, again, there's just 2 more that I like to use more. It's these 2 down here, which I'll going to save them for last because they're the best ones, in my opinion. So I'm going to go through these 3, which I think are the not so good ones. So Long Leash basically just says If you have a big Chaos Knight, an abhorrent model that has an aura ability, you can target a War Dog, and that War Dog's basically always in your aura ability. Fun fact, the only model that I really recommend running doesn't have abhorrent keyword, so I've never used the stratagem. I imagine there are some armies where you do run abhorrent models, but I just don't. Knights of Shade, basically you can target either a knight or 2 war dogs, and they can move through models and terrains as if they were not there. That's actually really good. Essentially what that does is it lets you, if you want to take a knight on your turn and you have a big piece of terrain and you want them to hide behind it so that they can't get shot at, or your opponent has to do some really crazy movement to shoot at them, Knights of Shade basically says you can do that this turn, and then afterwards you can just move through it as if it wasn't there. Second thing this also technically lets you do, because you can do it during the charge phase, you can start your turn behind a big piece of terrain and then move behind another one. And because you never started or ended your move in line of sight of an opponent, you can deny your opponent the ability to overwatch. And then you can pop this stratagem, charge through the terrain, and get them. There's not a lot of situations where that is crazy, but there are some armies that do really, really like Overwatch, so this kind of gives you an opportunity to overcome that. Diabolic Bulwark is a good stratagem. I'm going to just tell you right now, the list I usually recommend relies a lot on Night Lancers, which already have a 4-up Ambull and save, so I don't use Diabolic Bulwark that much. But this is really good at keeping your War Dogs alive, because they go to a 4-up Ambull and save. I only recommend running 1 War Dog in this list, and I do think that there are other stratagems, particularly these two, that are better than Bulwark in that situation, especially since the only War Dog I'm going to recommend is a shooting-based one, so he's not going to be up close and personal most of the time. But it can be useful in certain situations, much like almost any stratagem in the game. But that one's actually good. I just don't think it's good for us. So Disdain for the week. After my opponent has declared a target during fight phase, I can target a Chaos Knight, that's the target, and I can give him a 6-up Feel No Pain, or a 5-up Feel No Pain against Battle Shock units. It's just a good ability. Anytime you give really big models a lot of wounds, a Feel No Pain, it just increases their survivability by a bunch. I use this one fairly often, especially if I get charged, because that's huge. It's a good ability. Anything that adds more survivability onto Knights is a good stratagem, regardless of what it is, right? Unless it's useless, like Diabolic Bulwark can be sometimes, because if you already have a 4-up Ambull and save, it obviously doesn't matter. This next stratagem, Terror Shades, best stratagem in the whole book. So, anytime somebody fails a Battle Shock test, if I'm within 12 of you, which is going to happen because I am playing a melee army with big size models with big base sizes, right? I roll 66. For each 4-up, there is no cap to this, by the way. It can be full 6. For each 4-up, you take a mortal, and I regain a wound. Huge. What does that do? Punishes Battle Shock fails, A. Secondly, does more damage, which is something that this list can sometimes struggle to do because we focus a lot on having defensive abilities, and pushing damage is a little hard. And C, increases our survivability because now we're healing. Terror Shades applies so much Battle Shock pressure that your opponent really does have to think every time they roll a Battle Shock test, like, do I want to use my CP to auto pass this or not? Because if they don't, there's a chance that not only are they going to be taking damage, but also all the other debuffs they gain from Chaos Knights, like Doom and Darkness, is going to apply. And then I can do this. And then I can heal my own Knights, making them even more of a problem. I've legitimately had a Chaos Knight go from like 7 wounds to like 14 or 15 in a cycle of 1 turn, just from popping Terror Shades once during my turn and then popping it again during my opponent's because he failed 2 Battle Shocks. Huge stratagem. I always try to save a CP for Terror Shades. And then the rest of the strats, if I have extra CP, I'll try to use them, but I always try to have a CP for Terror Shades because it is just such a good strat. It adds on to the fact that, again, Chaos Knights is the best Battleshock army in the game because they get so many good Battleshock mechanics before they've even put a model down on the board. We've got -1s to Battleshock. We've got forced Battleshocks. We have debuffs for Battleshocks and damage from Battleshock fails. Really, really, really good. So that's it for the enhancements, or that's it for the stratagems. Now we'll go on to the enhancements. So Aura of Terror, I'm going to say flat out is the worst one. It basically says if you control a objective marker, it gets the 12-inch aura that all your knights have, which is the -1 to Battleshock and forcing Battleshocks if you're below starting strength. But if my opponent takes control over the objective marker, it loses that aura. The reason why this is bad is because most of the time, since your knights are very aggressive and you're sort of sending them up the board against most armies, you're already going to be within 12 to apply this aura. So there's not going to be a whole lot of times where you really need the extra auras from this enhancement. It doesn't pop up. It's the only enhancement out of the whole list of 3 of them that I probably have never ran. I think I ran it once or twice just to test it, and it didn't work. It never really mattered, and I felt like it was a waste of 25 points. So, meh. Lord of Dread, that is the best enhancement in this book. It says at start of fight phase, which is both fight phases, so I can do it during my opponent's turn and my turn, target a unit I'm in battle with. They have to take a Battleshock test. This stacks really, really well with, like, Disdain for the week. Because let's say I'm in combat with something and I pop Lord of Dread. Now, it fails a Battleshock. I can choose to Terror Shade it if I want to heal and just deal damage. Or, if I'm already at full health and I'm not going to kill it with Terror Shades, I can just use Disdain for the week. Oh my god. I can just use Disdain for the week, and now I have a 5-up Feel No Pain against it. So, yet again, another way to force Battleshock tests, and it actually combos well with some of the stratagems we have access to. Trader's Mark, it's a 30-point enhancement, so it's one of the 2 more expensive ones, but it gives a Chaos Knight Doom and Darkness for the entire battle instead of from battle round 3 onward. Not a huge deal, but it can sometimes help to just have a unit that constantly gets +1 to wound against Battleshock units and is -1 to hit against Battleshock units. I don't think it's really worth it that much as an enhancement, because, like, you're going to get that ability anyways, and turn 1 in 10th edition is becoming more of a positioning thing, and whereas turn 2 is the aggro, so you only really have to wait 1 turn to get the Doom and Darkness ability. I'd say if you have the points for Trader's Mark, there's probably nothing else in this army you're going to spend 30 points on, but not a necessity. Panoply of the Cursed Knights, the most expensive stratagem, or enhancement, which is fair because it gives a Chaos Knight the ability to reduce all incoming AP by 1. It's 40 points. This is a lot. It's pretty good. It's a pretty good enhancement because with how big your Chaos Knight models are and how generous cover is in this edition, if like one of my toes is covered with a Chaos Knight, I'm going to be getting cover. So basically with Panoply of the Cursed Knight, in the shooting phase, I'm going to be reducing all incoming AP by 2 because I'm going to get +1 to save and reduce AP by 1. So, not a bad ability. My biggest problem with it, though, is that, again, Chaos Knights is a melee-themed army. We're going to be charging in, so it's not going to... The -2 AP is not going to be coming in a lot. We're probably actually not going to be getting cover most of the time. And so because of that, this isn't going to get a lot of its usefulness. We're using Knight Lancers, which have a 3-up base save and a 4-up invuln in this army, mainly. So, it doesn't take a whole lot of AP to take them to that 4-up invuln save. So, I think Panoply of the Cursed Knights is a little lackluster. I think it'd be better if it wasn't 40 points. If it was like 30 or 25 like the rest of them, I think it'd be fine. I do think it's a little overpriced, but again, if you only have 40 points left in their list, there's really not anything else better to take aside from this. So that is the enhancements done. I'm not going to go over every single data sheet in this army. Shocker. I'm really only going to talk about probably 6 units. I'm going to talk about the Rampager, the Tyrant, the Lancer, which is the most important one, and then the War Dog Brigand, the War Dog Executioner, and then probably one of these Acastus Knights. So, let's talk about the Rampager. The Rampager is the one with the best melee weapons, but I'm presenting the Rampager to do a comparison because there's two really good melee units in this army. One is the Knight Lancer and one is the Rampager. Now, the Rampager does better damage, 100%. He's got sustained hits when he charges. He has two really good melee weapons. One has a better sweep profile than the other. The other one has a better strength profile. Although I do just think the Warp Strike Claw is better in most situations. But the Reaper Chainsword is better for its sweep mechanic. And the Warp Strike Claw is better for its strike mechanic. But he has a 12-inch move, 22 wounds, and a 5-up invuln save that is only applicable in shooting, and a 3-up base save. And obviously he has a shitty little gun with the Diabol's Heavy Stubber, but that doesn't matter. So he's not very good at surviving in melee, but he is good at doing damage. He's a very glass cannon, and he's also 380 points. Now, for an extra 30 points, we can run a Lancer. Or, sorry, I think it's actually 40 points. We get 3 more wounds, going from 22 to 25. We get 2 more inches of movement. We get a better invuln save that is also usable in the fight phase, which is huge. And the creme de la creme, we get to do tank shock for free. And because it is specifically named in the ability, thanks to the new data slate, it can be used more than once. So all of our Knight Lancers can do the same thing. For 40 more points, we get all those buffs. So generally speaking, although the Rampager looks really cool, I do recommend using the Knight Lancer. It's just the best one. Like both the Imperial Knights and the Chaos Knights have like one Knight model that is the Knight model you're supposed to run. And in Imperial Knights, you're either going to run their Knight Lancer or you're going to run their Crusader. And in Chaos Knights, you're running the Knight Lancer. And I think the Chaos Knight Lancer is actually better than the Imperial Knight Lancer. Because the Imperial Knight Lancer, I don't think gets this shock charge. Because we can actually just go compare him right now. Let's see, where is he? Oh, he does. Okay, so he gets the same thing. But keep in mind that his army rules aren't as good. This guy's going to be applying more of that battle shock pressure that I was talking about. So he's gonna be more of a problem because now he's forcing battle shocks to anything within 12 its below starting strength. He's giving a -1. He can terror shades. You know, this guy's not bad either. I just don't think that this army particularly is as... It's not as oriented towards this style of play, this charge in. So, really good. His melee weapons aren't as good as the Rampager, but not by much. I mean, he still does decent damage. Now, Tank Shock did get nerfed. It used to be equal to the strength of the weapon. Now it's equal to toughness. So we went from rolling basically 22 dice, because you got +2 if your strength is higher, and strength 20 is... There's nothing toughness 20 in this game, aside from, I think, maybe Warlord Titans. So you're rolling 22 dice. You're basically doing 6 mortal wounds every time you charge in. Now we're only rolling 12 dice, which means we're doing like 4 mortal wounds when we charge in. So a little bit of a nerf, but you're going to do 4 mortal wounds when you charge in most of the time. Then you get to fight. And then you still have things like Terror Shades, which you can use to stack even more damage on. These guys can heal themselves, unlike these guys who can't heal themselves. So, really good unit. Really good. The last big knight I wanted to talk about... That's a War Dog Stalker. The last big knight I wanted to talk about is the Tyrant. He's basically the Castellan from Imp Knights, but you can't deep strike within 12 of him, which is pretty good. He's really good at sitting on backfield objectives and shooting his big guns. I do think the only way that you can run him, though, is if you give him Panoply of the Cursed Knight, because it makes his 2-up save really hard to chew through. He does go to 550 points, however, when you do that, so I think he's a little too expensive. If we were running Imp Knights and this was the Castellans, I would recommend running him. But again, a lot of the abilities in Chaos Knights require you to be pretty close to your opponent, so you can be applying those debuffs and using your stratagems and getting into melee combat and scoring primary. So the Knight Tyrant and the Castellan, back during the early days of 10th when shooting armies could just table you, this guy was crazy. I mean, he had cover, he ignored -1 AP, so you needed a -3 AP on any of your weapons to take him to a 3-up save. He had a bunch of guns that did a lot of damage, like the Volcano Lance, but now that, there's more defensive tech in this game to make their shooting worse, like a -1 to hit on any unit with, like, stealth completely stops this guy from doing anything. His 3-up ballista skill on almost all his weapons except for the harpoon goes to a 4-up. Yike. The not being able to set up within 12 is okay, but a reason why I'm presenting the Tyrant is because some people may want to still play this model. I don't recommend it, but it still is playable. It just doesn't contribute to the whole list. So that's the last of the big knights I wanted to look at. And now I want to look at war dogs. And in my opinion, there's really only 2 that are worthwhile. You have the Executioner, who has a melta-gun, which is meh, and an autocannon, but he does buff his ballistic skill to +1 against things that are below half strength. So, biggest problem with war dogs is that they have decent guns. Almost all of them have really horrible melee weapons, but their ballistic skill is usually bad, being on that 3-up. This guy is one of the 2 that give themselves a better ballistic skill, but he is completely and utterly outclassed by this Brigand. This thing, first of all, takes 3 guns instead of the 2. Secondly, all of them are on 2-up ballistic skill. Huge. And lastly, it gives itself extra AP to when it targets closest model, which it will be doing most of the time. So now you've got an Avenger chain cannon, 12 shots, hitting on 2, strength 6, -2 AP, 1 damage, and you can spend a CP to give it sustained hits on all of its weapons. You've got a 24-inch multi-melta, hitting on 2s, 2 shots, strength 12, -5 AP, d6 +4 damage if you're within 12. And then you have the Diabolus Heavy Stubber, which is 6 shots, hitting on 2, strength 5, -1 AP, which is huge, important. It can get canceled out by some armies that are good at giving themselves cover or already ignore -1 APs or have stuff like Armor of Contempt. But that's still a resource that you're making them use by giving yourself an ability which you get for free, mind you. And 12-inch move. And an 8 OC that doesn't go down when you bracket. Crazy. Because all dogs have this -1 to hit bracket ability, but it matters so much less on a Brigand when its base ballistic skill is already a 2-up. Like on the Executioner, you go from hitting on 3s to hitting on 4s, but on this you go from 2s to 3s. Big difference. Definitely recommend the Brigand over all the other war dogs, because I think you have enough big models that can get into melee and are a lot better at melee than something like, you know, a Huntsman's Reaper Chain Talon or a Carnivore's Reaper Chain Talon or Slaughter Claw. I think the Knight Lancer, for sure, and even the Rampager are a lot better at being big melee beefsticks than anything the war dogs can. So the only war dogs I'd recommend running are the ones that are going to sit behind your big knights and either shoot at the stuff they're not in combat with, shoot at the stuff they're about to charge into, or honestly just sit on objectives. Because having an OC of 8 that doesn't go down when you bracket is really, really good. So, and the best war dog for shooting is the Brigand, just hands down. The last knight I wanted to look at is the Porphyrion. I don't think these models are worth it, but they are the big 30 wound mega knights. So if you're going to run, if you really want to run one of them, which there was a time when I did, this is the one that I'd recommend. Please take its 2 las cannons and please give it the Helios defense missiles, because those are the weapon options. The optional weapons are the better ones. But I don't recommend taking these. They're 700 points. They're way above their pay grade. They're funny because they're 30 wounds and they're big and they don't have a They don't have a base size because their models are sold by Forge World and they're so darn clunky and huge that they, you know, they don't need a base size. But don't run these. But if you have to run one, this is the one you should run. Just throwing it out there. And honestly, I'd probably just run them in Imperial Knights because they're better at shooting. So that's it for data sheets. The last thing I wanted to go over is Chaos Knights are really good with allies because they are in the generic Chaos. And I absolutely 100% recommend that you take Chaos Demons as some allies. Biggest thing that Chaos Knights struggle with is having a low model count, which means that they struggle with scoring position-based secondaries like investigate signals, engage on all fronts, behind enemy lines, area denial, deploy teleport homer, and capture enemy outposts. Those are big secondaries that score lots of points, which they struggle really hard to score with. So running Chaos Demons that have Deep Strike allows them to sort of score more points than they normally would be able to. The demons I actually recommend running, ironically, first off, go to Demonic Pact. If you want to run anything that isn't a battle line unit, you have to run at least one of its battle line units. So the model I recommend running is honestly a Keeper of Secrets. They have a 4-up invuln save, they're toughness 10 with 18 wounds, they're -1 to hit, and they have a 5-up feel no pain, and they're less than 300 points. Pretty good. They have a 14-inch move too, and an OC of 5 with a leadership of 6. These are good models. If you need this to sit on your home objective the entire game, go ahead because they're super hard to kill. But if you want to keep this thing in Deep Strike and charge it up the board, believe me, it's going to work. It's got a 14-inch move. She is scary. She's got, a Wit Stealer sword, which is flat 3 damage, hitting on 2s, and snapping claws, which are flat 3 damage as well, and have dev wounds. Scary model. Now, in order to run the Keeper Secrets, obviously you have to run the Daemonettes. That's what we went over the Demonic Pact for. But that's not a big deal, because Daemonettes is a squad of 10 for 20 OC with Deep Strike, and they're small base sizes, so you're going to be able to Deep Strike them in and get them into position so that you can score secondaries like all the ones that I just named. So not a bad thing. Not a bad thing at all. Definitely put them in Deep Strike, though. They die very, very fast. They're only going to be useful for scoring secondaries. So this part of the video is going to be devoted to the Legends models. There's only one Legend model I'm going to show. If you don't use Legend models in your battles, please use the timestamp in the video to skip this part because everything I'm about to say is going to be a waste of time for you. But if you do use Legend models, please, 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 please run the Ambull. It's an 85-point model that starts off in Deep Strike, and it has an ability at the end of your opponent's movement phase. It can go back into Deep Strike, and it can do that ability twice. Now, when it does that, it has to come back onto the field during the next movement phase, but that's not a huge deal because basically what you want to do with this guy is the second you get a position-based secondary, like the ones I said before, investigate signals, engage on all fronts, deploy teleport homer, area denial, capture enemy outposts, and behind enemy lines. Deep Strike this guy in, he goes back into Deep Strike during your opponent's next turn, and then if you get another position-based secondary on your next turn, boom, he's coming down a second time. If you don't get a position-based secondary, you can also just put him on an objective marker. Maybe you have a Night Lancer that's currently sitting on an objective, and you want him to go charge into something, but you don't want him to leave the objective behind. The Ambull could just Deep Strike behind him and sit there. So, yeah, absolutely would recommend running the Ambull. He makes the secondaries in this game so much easier to score, and he takes so much pressure off of the Chaos Knight army in general, which is just so good. So, for my list recommendation, there's 2 lists that I'm going to recommend. One uses the Ambull as a Legends model. The other one doesn't. So the one that uses the Ambull, I'm going to recommend running 3 Night Lancers. Obviously, they're the best model, in my opinion, in this whole army. We have enough points, so I've given each of them an enhancement. I've given 1 Trader's Mark. I've given 1 Panoply of the Cursed Knights, which is the one that's my Warlord, because in theory he should be the hardest one to kill. And then I also have given 1 Lord of Dread, because that enhancement is crazy. I'm running 1 War Dog Brigand, with a Diabolus heavy stubber, an Ambull, a squad of daemonettes, and a single keeper of secrets with a shining aegis. Now, if you don't want to run legend models, like you don't want to run the Ambull, or your group doesn't let you, that's fine. I have a list for that as well. My list without the Ambull is just 3 Knight Lancers, no enhancements, 2 War Dog Brigands with heavy stubbers, and then a squad of daemonettes and a keeper of secrets. Those lists should be up on screen. They'll also be down in the description below if you just want to read those. So thank you guys for watching. I hope that this will help you play Chaos Knights in 10th, especially with Pariah and Nexus around the corner, because we got some changes to our army. You know, we got changes to tank shock, and also now our Titanic units can fight and still perform actions. So I'm hoping to see more Chaos Knight players, because I do think that it is a pretty cool faction, and it is very much being capable of being played on a competitive level in this edition. But see you guys next week. And we should have a battle report up next week instead of another faction debrief. But if you guys like this sort of stuff where I talk about a faction debrief, or you want me to do your faction, just comment down the video and let me know. I don't mind making this kind of content. It's a lot more free and a lot more lackadaisical. And I feel like I am knowledgeable enough of this game to be able to deduce what is the good way to build an army and what isn't. So, see you guys next time.